Good morning and Happy New Year. Today we heard one of my favorite biblical wishes for prosperity from the prophet Isaiah. May a multitude of camels cover you. 2020 was a hard year for many. Fires, weeks of smoke, loss of homes, a global pandemic that changed the way we worship, learn, and relate to others, racial unrest, a difficult election, isolation, desolation, and despair all around. But it wasn't all bad. We found new ways to do church and connect with people far and wide. Vaccines are being produced and are on the way. For me, I had many blessings throughout the year, not quite a multitude of camels, but I have much to be grateful for. I saw God's light working in my life, illuminating hidden places. Arise, shine, for your light has come, says the prophet Isaiah. In the gospel reading, we hear about a star that guided visitors from the east to Jesus. Light is a theme in the Advent, Christmas, and Epiphany readings. There are many ways we think of God's light. A light can enlighten ourselves or others. God's light can shine through us as we help people. God's light can provide a spark that gives us meaning or purpose. God's light can illuminate people or histories that were hidden. I want to share with you some of the ways God's light shined in my life last year. At the start of the year, I chose a star from the church wall. The word on the back was remembrance, especially significant because at the time I was in the process of interviewing for a position as a hospice chaplain. In this role, I walk alongside patients and their families through this final journey and transition. God's light shined to remind me that as a Christian, death is not the end of the story. Every time I see a patient reaching out for something I cannot see or speak of people or angels coming for them, I am reminded that there is something after this life. God showed me that there is hope in death. I see people find meaning and purpose in being sick. I see people forgiving and asking for forgiveness. I see people whose love does not die but transforms, just like the beautiful green grass that sprouts up in a burn area. I see sprouts of new life coming up in spouses and family members as they move through the grief process. Some things that God's light illuminate in my work make me uncomfortable. I squirm whenever I see the injustices of our healthcare system, especially when it involves race, culture, and class. I believe God is calling me to examine my own racism and the racism in our systems. I participated in the Sacred Ground group, and God's light illuminated the ways I heard racist messaging and stereotypes my entire life. The messages I heard growing up affects my perceptions of people from different race and class groups. The Sacred Ground curriculum uses the idea of normative racism. This means that we grew up bombarded with racial stereotypes and messages through the media and history classes, and sometimes from our own families. Normalized racism says that with these messages, it would be remarkable not to be racist or to not have unconscious bias. Having racist thoughts or unconscious bias does not make me a bad person. It makes me human and a product of my social location. It's what I do with these thoughts and biases that matter. Do I continue to act as I always have? Or do I stop and do something different? Do I question if I am making this assumption or judgment because of my unconscious bias? In Sacred Ground, we explored the historical narratives around racial and ethnic minority groups. I learned more about the slave trade. I learned that the education I received about Indigenous people in the 1980s was the same as my group members who grew up in the 1940s and 50s. Our group discussed the racial narratives we heard at home. It is important to examine these narratives we heard growing up and question if there is more to the story. I grew up in Georgia with overtly racist messaging, with family members who use the N-word prolifically, and hearing revisionist history of the Civil War, that the war was not fought over slavery, but economics. It was easier for me to see that I have these unconscious bias and racist thoughts because the messaging I heard was overtly racist. I noticed it is harder for people who grew up in other places to recognize the more subtle racist messaging. My seminary classmate who works in Episcopal schools reports that it is easier for him to do the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion in Georgia than when he was at a school in San Francisco, because people in Georgia more easily recognize that they have a racial bias and need to do the work. I have quite a bit of overtly racist attitudes and unconscious biases against other races, classes, and body types. I try not to beat myself up about this because it would be remarkable if they were not present in me. When I notice these attitudes and biases come up, I have a choice to make. Being aware of my bias helps me to make adjustments in my behavior or assumptions about people. God's light illuminates and gives me the courage to do this. God's light has also illuminated some uncomfortable truths about our church. I officially started seminary in June. God's light was present through the summer and fall classes as I learned about the Episcopal Church's role or lack thereof in slavery and abolition. I learned about the relationship between Southern slaveholders and the New York City center of the Episcopal Church. Clergy throughout the country were barred from speaking out against slavery. As I learned about John Henry Hopkins, Bishop of Vermont, who wrote several pamphlets and a book about how the Bible endorsed slavery. Hopkins' son, by the way, John Henry Hopkins Jr., wrote our beloved Epiphany carol, We Three Kings. But his dad, John Henry Hopkins Sr., was presiding bishop in 1865 and welcomed back the white Southern bishops into the church with no provisions for the many Black Episcopalians throughout the South to have their own clergy or churches. This brought about an exodus of Black people from the church, leaving the Episcopal Church as a mostly white institution. This was all shocking to me because the Episcopal Church that I've known for the past 44 years is a progressive institution focused on justice and equity. This was very much not always the case, and it is important to recognize our past so that we can go forward to be the church that God calls us to be. In my seminary classes, I also learned about the concept of Orientalism. Orientalism is the idea that people from the East were uncivilized, undeveloped, and exotic, inferior to white Europeans. Orientalism is a way of othering people outside Europe and was the basis for colonialism. In Orientalism, European ways are the norms and everyone else's way is different or special. When we look at the portrayals of the Magi in art and literature, we see examples of this exoticism with the three wise men bearing gifts coming from, all these exotic places of the East. An entire legend sprung up about the Magi, giving them names and places of origin that were not in the Bible. God's light is still illuminating things for me in this area. As I watched the Nutcracker with my family, I noticed Orientalism in the Arabian and Chinese dances and in the battle scenes where the Rat King is defeated by the Nutcracker's regimented army. Preparing for this sermon, I started asking questions like, well, I practice yoga several times a week. How does that fit in with Orientalism? Is doing yoga cultural appropriation? Cultural appropriation is when we take something from another culture and remove the context and people from the practice. When we think of yoga as purely an exercise, We miss the deep spiritual practice involved in the fact that people in India have been practicing yoga for thousands of years. Many people who practice yoga do not know the meaning of the word namaste, said at the end of many yoga practices. Namaste literally means, I bow to you. I bow to you. You who are on this journey of exploring racism and doing the hard work of examining your own biases and white supremacy. It is hard work, no matter where you are, if you are just starting or if you have been on this road for many years. I believe this is how God works to change the world, through us, through our questions and our feeling uncomfortable. God broke into the world when Jesus was born, when Jesus was made known to the people of other nations, when Jesus died and was resurrected. God is still breaking in. Every time you wonder, why do I feel the need to lock my car doors on this street? God is breaking in. Every time we ask, is our church welcoming to people from different cultures who look, act, or speak differently? God is breaking in. Every time we catch ourselves assuming that the way we do things is the normal way, and then realize that our way is not the norm, but a way, God is breaking in. When we allow ourselves to ask painful questions about traditions we hold dear, God is breaking in. People at work sometimes think it's strange when I pray for healing for a hospice patient. I see healing as not the absence of disease, but of being made whole. By letting God's light break in and illuminate places in ourselves and in our culture that might be painful to look at, we are doing our part to heal the world. Where is God inviting you for healing this year? What places is God illuminating for you? Where is God's star leading you? Arise, shine, for your light has come. Amen.